Here are some very important constructs, very important notions when you're talking about virtual reality as a research method. Ecological validity and experimental control. Ecological validity basically means to what extent is the situation in which you test a certain question similar to the everyday situation that you're actually interested in. So if you're interested in building a theory about how people communicate in everyday life, how similar is your study setup to that everyday phenomenon that you're interested in? It can be very similar to it, or it can be very different. To what extent does your method actually allow you to build a theory that generalizes to the phenomenon that you're actually interested in? Experimental control, on the other hand, is a bit easier. It simply means how much control do you have as a researcher, as an experimenter, over what's sort of going on in your study, what happens in your experiment, in your lab experiment, for instance. And for a long time, researchers, more or less implicitly, I think, have seen those two constructs as two ends on a continuum, meaning that experimental researchers wanted to have a lot of experimental control to be able to have certain very specific measurements without a lot of noise in the data. And they've sort of more or less assumed that in order to make such a situation possible in the lab, it would sort of go at the expense of the ecological validity of the study. So researchers would be saying things like, well, I just need a lot of experimental control to make those very specific brain measurements. And therefore, the sort of experimental setup that I provide my participants with doesn't really resemble the everyday phenomenon that I'm interested in. But that's okay, because I get a lot of experimental control. I can very specifically measure what I'm interested in. If you think of studies in the field of language and communication, if you're interested in learning more about language, about how people communicate, what you of course could do is observe people in their everyday behavior. You look at how they use language, you analyze this, and then you come up with a certain theory. And this is typically very ecologically valid, because what you're interested in, everyday language and communication, that's also what you're observing. That's also what you're studying. You just have people talk, communicate, as they would typically do in their everyday life. You just observe this, for instance, by videotaping them and then afterwards analyzing what they're saying, how they are moving, what they're actually doing when they're communicating. Very ecologically valid. So the chances are very high that if you build a theory based on those observations, that it will generalize to everyday behavior, because actually you have been observing this everyday behavior. And on the other end of this continuum, you could say there are many computer experiments. That was the idea. So the idea is there you have a lot of experimental control, but it's not so ecologically valid. If you think of this participant sitting in front of a computer screen doing a simple and repetitive task, that's not very similar to how we're communicating using language in everyday life most of the time, right? So there is a lot of control over what will happen in this experiment, but perhaps it's not so ecologically valid. Based on those assumptions, people have said, well, those two constructs, you can sort of place them on a continuum. If you want to make it more ecologically valid, your research study paradigm, you will by definition lose some experimental control. If you want to have some more experimental control, you will lose some of the ecological validity of the study, perhaps. Right, and then this, of course, leads to all those problems, theoretical problems that we have been talking about. So to what extent can those theories that you build on those very strict experimental paradigms can be assumed to generalize to this everyday behavior? We cannot be completely sure of this, right? So that leads to all those problems. I think one additional problem is that perhaps this continuum is actually false. This is not the right way of thinking about those two constructs. I think VR actually shows that this continuum is not completely correct. So perhaps a better way to think about those constructs is in an orthogonal way, such that you can have a certain experimental paradigm, a certain research paradigm. You can place it on one continuum from having a lot of experimental control to hardly any experimental control. And the same actually holds for ecological validity. And actually, where you want to be, typically, I assume as a researcher, is somewhere here, such that you have both high experimental control, so you can make very specific measurements related to this one thing that you're interested in, But at the same time, you do this in an environment that sort of offers you high ecological validity that's more or less similar to the situation that the everyday situation that you're actually interested in. And virtual reality, typically, if you use it well, could be placed somewhere here in this quadrant. So it sort of offers you the best of both worlds. It still allows you as a researcher to do experiments in the lab. So you have quite some control over what will happen during the experiment. But this experiment looks very much like the everyday world, the everyday phenomenon that you're interested in. So it can be very rich and can be very dynamic and communicative. It's in 3D, it's not in 2D, it's on a computer screen. So it sort of offers you the best of both worlds. So takeaway point here is that this continuum with, on one end, experimental control, and on the other end, ecological validity perhaps is false. It's a false way of looking at things. Virtual reality, immersive virtual reality, shows that you can sort of have both high ecological validity and high experimental control in ideal situations, leading to theories that are very strictly based on experimentally manipulated questions, very clear experimental designs, but still carried out in very rich environments. Meaning that hopefully those theories that are built on the basis of data collected in those more rich environments will more likely generalize to those very rich everyday situations, to all aspects of those very rich everyday situations.